Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to many of you. Welcome back to this second session of our virtual conference, Voting Matters, which explores 6 moments and numerous themes in the history of gender and citizenship in the United States. Today's panel centers on and around 1870, the year of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which stated that, quote, "the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." The Reconstruction amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, marked the first time an individual right to vote entered the language of the Constitution. With the 14th Amendment in 1868, the word male and a sex qualification on the vote also entered the supreme law of the United States. These amendments, which formally enfranchised African American men after their decades-long freedom struggle, caused a schism in the movement for women's suffrage. That, at least, is the familiar story. Our panelists today tell much fresher and urgent histories about American citizenship circa 1870. As Martha Jones did in her session on origin stories in this conference a couple weeks back, they'll remind us of the importance of recognizing multiple and braided histories, of the importance of intellectual and community spaces beyond formal politics, especially the church, of the importance of demands for civic personhood that often extended beyond the vote and didn't always include it, and of the importance of polities within and beyond the United States. Indeed, today's talks cover an especially broad expanse of territories and sovereignties for what we might call a wide 19th Amendment as well as a long one. Guiding us around this massive terrain are 3 expert speakers and a gifted moderator. I'll introduce them very briefly in the order in which they're speaking, which is a kind of geographic order, moving in their subjects from the East Coast west across the contested North American continent in the years following the United States' Civil War. Brittany Cooper is Associate Professor of History and Women's Gender and Sexuality at Rutgers University, as well as a prolific author of books including Beyond Respectability, the Intellectual Thought of Race Women, published in 2017. Many of you will also know her as a social media force through the Crunk Feminist Collective, which she co-founded in the early 20-teens. Amanda Cobb Greetham is Professor of Native American Studies and Director of the Native Nations Center at the University of Oklahoma. A member of the Chickasaw Nation, she has served numerous roles in the government and tribal cultural history of her tribe, as well as publishing extensively on Indigenous history and culture, particularly in Oklahoma. Her book, Listening to Our Grandmother's Stories, the Bloomfield Academy for Chickasaw Females, and much of the writing she has done since speaks directly to many of our themes today. Beth Lou Williams, Associate Professor of History at Princeton, is the author of The Chinese Must Go, Violence, Exclusion, and the Making of the Alien in America, published in 2018, and having since won 5 prizes from 4 different scholarly organizations. Her work centers on the history of Chinese immigrants in the United States, often with particular attention to gender. Each of these brilliant panelists will share brief remarks, teasing out a theme, an idea, or a question that our moderator, Professor Manisha Sinha of the University of Connecticut, will then braid into a conversation among them. You will know Professor Sinha as a preeminent historian of abolitionism and now of Reconstruction in the United States. Last year, we were very fortunate at Radcliffe to have her as a Mellon Schlesinger Fellow in residence. After the panelists share their ideas, Professor Sinha will moderate questions from the audience, and you can use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit questions at any point during the program. The speakers will address as many as they can. There were over 1,000 of you registered, so we anticipate a lot of questions and ask you to keep them short to increase the likelihood that we can address as many as possible. Finally, I want to acknowledge the generosity of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, whose philanthropy underwrote the Schlesinger Library's Long 19th Amendment project, and to acknowledge as well the members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and our annual donors who are watching this afternoon. Their generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public, and we thank them. And it's now my pleasure to pass the virtual floor over to Brittany Cooper. Professor Cooper.
Thank you. Thank you, Jane. Thank you to the Radcliffe community and to my fellow panelists and moderator for this opportunity to talk about the importance of voting rights and suffrage. I want to begin by just talking about two women who had a really different relationship to the 15th Amendment. These were Black women. One was Charlotte Rollin. She was part of an elite group of Black women, particularly her and her three sisters from South Carolina, who spent much of the time during the Civil War and certainly in 1870 arguing for the right of Black women for the vote. And one of the arguments that Charlotte Rollin makes in 1870, after the 15th Amendment has already been ratified, is that voting rights are human rights. She says that people should be allowed to vote, that Black people should be allowed to vote because voting rights are human rights. And then I want to point your attention to Marianne Shad Carey, a famous Black woman attorney who graduates from the Howard University School of Law in 1870, but prior to that had fled to Canada because of racial repression here in the United States and had built a life as a journalist in Canada. And in the late 1860s, she comes back to the United States. She completes a law degree. And in 1870, she sues the US Congress. She brings suit in order to be allowed to vote in District of Columbia elections, and she wins. So on the one hand, we have an amendment that has been passed that grants suffrage to African American men, but we also have Black women who use that same opportunity to continue to press the argument that their voting rights matter. But part of what I want to suggest today is that we have to then think about what citizenship actually means for Black women. And are they making a similar argument about citizenship as their white counterparts? I would argue that they're making really distinct arguments about how they understand citizenship to function. And so if you think about the argument being made by somebody like Charlotte Rollin, she is not thinking solely in terms of a state-based or US state-based project, in part because Black people already know the sort of fragility or fickleness of that project and the ways that there's no reason to believe in 1870, given the partial nature of the way rights are being doled out, even in the post-Civil War period, in the Reconstruction period, that this is going to be a project wherein Black people can stake all of their hopes and dreams. And so she automatically goes for a more expansive notion beyond the state to say that it is a human right for people to participate in the way that they are being governed. And so that tells us something about the broad variety of ways in which African American women have had to reimagine their own citizenship project beyond the confines of what white women were demanding, beyond the confines of what Black men were demanding, but creating a framework in which they could be heard. The second thing that I think the moment of the way that famous white women suffragists kind of threw Black women under the bus very particularly and attempted to throw Black men under the bus for their own gain is that moment really sets the terms of feminist struggles from the 1870s at least, and certainly perhaps earlier up until the present day. And so this distrust, this deploying of racial and racist tropes in order to argue about African American people's fitness for citizenship is a kind of racist narrative that white women traffic in and that they attempt to propagate. So I'm thinking about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony literally making arguments about how they don't want Black men to be under the feet of Black men and how they don't think that Black folks, because they are uneducated, are worthy of the vote. And so this is also why African American women have to forge their own narrative of what US citizenship means for them. And I think one of the ways that we see the legacy of that today is in this idea that African American women are always making an argument for the necessity both of an expansive view of citizenship and for the need for strong and robust public institutions. And so it sometimes infuriates folks when you see the consistency with which African American women vote for like the most kind of literally vanilla candidates in the Democratic Party. But some of that has to do with this long history of trying to shore up a citizenship project that will actually work and that will hold their needs. The last thing that I want to say is that we see that kind of set of voting practices happening because Black women have never viewed the vote as a means as the end in itself. They have never viewed the vote as the trophy of becoming a full, participant in a democracy. They really see the vote, and they're making the claim about the vote very early on as doing really critical kinds of things. So by 1910, you see Ida B. Wells saying that to not be able to vote is that if we cannot vote, we cannot protect human life. And she's talking about the anti-lynching struggle. She argues in 1910 that if the vote is taken, if the country is willing to strip Black people of the vote, it is one step away from being willing to strip them of their lives. And so she's trying to protect against a sort of necropolitical impulse in the US context to actually devalue Black life. And she says that the vote is the first stopgap that Black women have. And I would argue that that continues to be a part of the way Black women understand the vote today as a stopgap measure to keeping the state or signaling to the state that they must protect Black life. And finally, in the 1920s, you see a writer like Alice Dunbar Nelson arguing that one of the reasons that Black women specifically need the vote is because it is the way that they will win their own economic freedom. So from 1870, for the next 50 years, you see Black women making a very particular set of arguments about what citizenship means to them, how they understand voting within that, the crux of that. And they don't make the argument based upon sort of white notions of liberal equality. They really make it in terms of these ideas that we come to understand as more global ideas about human rights. And they come to make these arguments with a very clear intention of, one, protecting Black life, and two, securing a more economically liberal set of possibilities for Black people. It's now my pleasure to pass the mic to Amanda Cobb Greetham. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great. For my part today, I would like to interrogate the notion of polity and the ways in which the concept is very much predicated on a Western normative notion of government and a Western normative notion of political engagement. So think about this. If we acknowledge the many indigenous sovereigns in existence at this time and who still exist as political and cultural entities today, well, then we change the conversation from polity to polities, and we complicate the notions of what political engagement can even look like. So first, I'd like to provide some context regarding the experience of tribal nations at the national level, and then focus specifically on the Chickasaw Nation in Indian Territory. So let's look at 1870. As the United States attempted to reconstruct the US polity in 1870, it worked relentlessly to deconstruct and dismantle indigenous sovereigns at the same time. So while this panel is placing special significance on 1870, Native nations placed special significance on the following year, 1871. Why? That was the formal end of the treaty-making era. And instead of treaty making, the US instead turned its attention to pursuing westward expansion militarily through the Indian Wars and ending diplomatic relationships with Native nations, and this is a notable shift, treated individual Indians as wards of the US government who were in need of civilization and assimilation and who were deemed not fit and not yet ready for citizenship. Okay, so that's the national picture, but what's happening in Indian Territory? And if you all could please show the first slide, that would be great. So as you can see, forced removal impacted dozens of tribes. Many people don't know that. The first of the nations to face removal were the 5 tribes of the South, who for many years experienced a distinctly high level of autonomy in Indian Territory. In fact, as noted in the US Supreme Court case, Atlantic and Pacific Railroad Company v. Mingus, The court wrote, "The Indian Territory stands in an entirely different relation to the United States from other territories and is to be considered as an independent country. The Indians have proceeded to establish and carry on independent governments of their own, enacting and executing their own laws." So, from European contact on, and most dramatically from the formation of the United States and forward, indigenous nations, and in this case, the Chickasaw Nation, experienced radical political and cultural upheaval. Some of these changes, there were many changes, some of these changes included coping with the trauma of disease, death, and warfare, intermarrying, adopting different religious practices, participating in the American chattel slavery system, and recasting traditional gender roles. And the brutal forced removal from their homeland in the 1830s fractured the traditional hereditary forms of government that had been in place for so long, and it led to a new constitutional government system. Now, here's my point. This represented an entirely different type of political engagement. The very idea of voting was a new thing for Chickasaws, who were just beginning to understand how suffrage could be used and to what end in a new political system. Why vote? What kind of power does that give you? Why? So, after the US Civil War, through the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, the US attempted to dissolve tribal governments entirely and dissolve tribal cultures at the same time in Indian Territory through the allotment of lands, the requiring of US citizenship as part of allotment, and I would like to point out here that US citizenship was not considered desirable, and the establishment of tribal rolls through the Dawes Allotment Act. These tribal rolls were an attempt for an external to construct the tribal polity and to base it on a racial classification system, a blood quantum system, which had not ever, I'd like to point out the blood quantum system had not been part of the Chickasaws' cultural sense of identity. Okay, so let's think about women, Chickasaw women in this moment. Well, post-Civil War, the Chickasaw Nation was reconstructing its own polity, and this was complex and challenging. The Chickasaw population was far outnumbered in its own territory at this moment, including Civil War refugees from the Creek and Cherokee nations, freedmen of all 5 tribes and from other states, and a tidal wave of illegal white settlers. So the Chickasaw Nation actually petitioned the US to remove all those that they did not understand to be Chickasaw, which indicates a desire for some kind of cultural continuance, some kind of political integrity, but really the question was becoming, what does it mean to be Chickasaw at this moment? And at the same time, white settlers were agitating successfully for land. Oklahoma Territory was established in 1890, which continues to explode the number of polities in this area. And if you could please show the third image, I hope this illustrates this. These are 4 government seals, and they represent the different polities in which women could engage. Chickasaw women had choices to make. How to engage, with which polity? With the Chickasaw Nation? With the proposed all-Indian state of Sequoia? With the state of Oklahoma? Each of these choices would come with US citizenship, and none of them would come with women's suffrage. Chickasaw women had previously enjoyed a great deal of power in the traditional governmental system. That governmental system was no more. What does this look like now? And so the question becomes, when does suffrage make sense and to what greater end? So here's what I'd like you to think about today. That notions of polity and government are complex and are always embedded in cultures. And that suffrage in a representational democracy represented a tremendous cultural shift, and perhaps especially for women from a matrilineal or matriarchal tradition. Notions of race, culture, and citizenship were entangled and contested in every area. But here's the thing. Native women did have significant presence throughout the territorial period and after statehood in 1907, and I argue continue to understand themselves as Chickasaw women and then as American Indian women more broadly. And if you would please show the final image, I love this. This is very exciting to me. This is a 1910, that's post-Oklahoma statehood, 1910 suffrage handbill of the Oklahoma Woman Suffrage Association, which was the result of the merging of two women's associations, the Oklahoma Association and the Indian Territory Association. And I hope you're looking closely, it's written in Choctaw language, which is related to and mutually intelligible to Chickasaw language. And that it is in Choctaw, that it is carrying language forward at this moment, post-statehood, is very significant. So today, Native Americans are citizens of the tribal nation, the state nation, and the United States. And as a Chickasaw woman and an Oklahoman, I can and I do vote in all three. And with that, it is my pleasure to pass the virtual floor to Beth. Thank you very much, Chokmashki.
Thanks so much. I wanted to start by saying how grateful I am for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. I've spent a lot of time thinking about Chinese immigrants in the 19th century, and I've never been asked to talk about how this history intersects with women's suffrage. And maybe my talk will give you some sense of why I've never been asked, but it really was a great thing to try to think with. So in 1870, when the 15th Amendment was ratified, a series of barriers still lay between Chinese women and suffrage in the United States. Their sex, their race, their alienage, and their sexuality formed the basis of their exclusion from the polity. Any one of these exclusions would have been enough, but together they formed an obstacle of towering heights. So let me just go through these obstacles. At the time, Chinese migrants were barred from being naturalized US citizens. In 1790, the Naturalization Act had reserved naturalization for free white persons. The 1868 Burlingame Treaty with China had confirmed that Chinese immigrants could not naturalize as US citizens. And then in 1870, when Congress extended the right of naturalization to, quote, aliens of African nativity and to persons of African descent, lawmakers again purposefully excluded the Chinese. So the exclusion of Chinese from citizenship meant that Chinese women in America didn't even have sort of nominal representation in politics via male family members. But not only did Chinese women face exclusion from citizenship based on their race, they also faced severe barriers to enter the country in the first place. In 1870, the California legislature passed a law that they titled, quote, "An Act to Prevent the Kidnapping and Importation of Mongolian, Chinese, and Japanese females for criminal or demoralizing purposes." So in other words, in the name of halting sex trafficking, the law restricted the immigration of Asian women based on assumptions of their sexuality, and namely their propensity for lewdness or for prostitution. When the Supreme Court found that state law to be unconstitutional, Congress passed a similar law at the federal level. That's the 1875 Page Act, one of the first federal immigration laws specifically designed to keep, and it's one of the first federal immigration laws, and it was specifically designed to keep out Chinese women and girls. So cultural norms and immigration law made it really difficult for Chinese women to immigrate to the United States, and the results were dramatic. If we look at the 1880 census in the United States, it recorded a mere 4,779 Chinese women living within the United States. Perhaps even more dramatically, there were 18 Chinese men for every one Chinese woman in the United States at the time. The skewed sex ratio, along with anti-miscegenation laws, really stunted the formation of a second generation of Chinese Americans. And that lack of a Chinese American community meant that there were not many natural born US citizens. So given these stark realities for Chinese women in the 1870s, I'm afraid that suffrage was far from their minds. If we look forward into the 20th century, we can tell a story of Chinese American suffragists like Mabel Pinghua Li, but I haven't seen any evidence that they exist in the 19th century. And for this reason, I actually think that the question of women's suffrage is the wrong question. If what we really want to know is about what we really want to understand is the lives of Chinese women in the United States. I don't think we should sort of presuppose what forms of inclusion and political power Chinese women wanted at this time. So rather than assuming that Chinese women were aspiring US citizens, I think it's more useful to consider what Chinese women actually were asking for in the 1870s. And one place that we can find answers in the American courts. In my work, I've been spending a lot of time recently looking at civil and criminal legal records to try to see what claims Chinese women were making on the American state at the time. You know, legal records are one of those rare locations in the 19th century where we see Chinese women's words preserved, albeit in translation. So I'm going to give you a few examples very quickly about things they were asking for. So for example, there was a Chinese woman named Ah Sun who went to court in 1873 in Los Angeles to accuse a Chinese man of robbing her of a hairpin. So the alleged crime was robbery, but the tale she tells in court is one of a violent attempted kidnapping. And so through her testimony, she's calling on the US justice system to protect her from trafficking from within the Chinese community itself, as well as assault on her person and on her property. Or we could look at Si Can, who in 1874 in Placer County, California, sued the Central Pacific Railroad. She alleged that through negligence, the railroad had allowed a train to run off the rails and kill her husband. She wanted $1,000 in compensation for her and her children. Playing on assumptions about Chinese women's sexuality, the Central Pacific Railroad tried to dismiss this lawsuit, alleging that her marriage was invalid. And so through her suit, Si Can was calling on the US justice system to give her compensation, but also just to validate her marriage, to recognize that a Chinese woman could be a lawful wife in the United States. Or we could listen to Ah Toy, who was detained upon arrival in San Francisco Harbor in 1874 due to California's bar on Asian prostitutes. She and 21 other women filed a writ of habeas corpus, alleging that they had been unlawfully confined. With her sexual morality under question, because she was an alleged prostitute, she endured an interrogation in court about her marriage, her family, her labor, her property, and her arrival. And in response to this barrage of questions, she admonished the court from the witness stand. According to her translator, and I quote, she said, "My husband didn't dare ask me so many questions. Why should you ask me so many?" She wanted, in short, the right to enter the United States without government investigation into her sexual and familial history. In the 1870s, Chinese women were not fighting for suffrage, but they were fighting for other forms of state recognition. And I think that means that in their own way, they were fighting for civil and immigrant rights as well. So now I'm going to pass the mic to our moderator, Manisha Sinha.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you, Amanda and Brittany too, for your wonderful presentations. Extremely rich, given the short amount of time you had, and you opened up, new vistas in terms of how we understand this moment for women's rights, for gender in the United States. It's definitely not the conventional story. And I'd like to begin with just asking the three of you to think about how your work really changes our understanding of gender and Reconstruction, how we can pivot away from those traditional stories of the schism in the suffrage movement, as Jane referred to earlier, and think about how different women from different positionalities, different polities, as Amanda called them, but also within the United States, are contesting traditional narratives about democracy, citizenship claims, claims rights making. We just get a much broader notion of what citizenship means, as Brittany pointed out. And I'd like to begin with her and then have you speak in the order that you spoke so that we have some order here. And then I will raise some specific questions for each one of you. So Brittany, if you could get us started.
Sure. Look, I mean, this is the Reconstruction period, and, lots of African-American scholars have talked ably about the ways that African-American women were literally trying to construct a narrative of what womanhood meant for them. I write in my first book, Beyond Respectability, about the kinds of narratives of gender that are being offered during the Reconstruction era and well into the 20th century, these narratives about what it meant to be a respectable man or a respectable woman. But I also think that we can argue that African-American people also have their own argument about what it means to reconstruct the nation and how they understand what the US should be. And that means that voting and suffrage becomes a particular site for the contestation of what form the nation will take in the aftermath of the Civil War. And more specifically, African-American women have a vested interest because part of what the 15th Amendment does is it installs patriarchy as a route to Black male equality and says that Black men will be given the right to understand themselves as citizens, at least in terms of the law. We know that African-American men are absolutely violently suppressed from the public sphere at the end of Reconstruction and into the Jim Crow period. But there is this overture towards patriarchy as the pathway, and there continues to be that overture to Black men that we struggle with culturally and politically within Black communities around why patriarchy is seen as a site of citizenship building for Black men. At the point that that's off the table for African-American women, then they've got to make a very different set of claims about what they understand the US nation state project to be, and then how they understand their own kind of traversal through that project. And so this is why you get these expansive claims about the vote as a human right, or the vote as a thing that protects Black life, or the vote as something that can procure African-American women's economic freedom, which should be understood to also be their freedom, not just from the exigencies of white supremacy, but also from any kind of domination that might be put forth by Black men.
Amanda, if you could jump in then, and I will follow up with questions for each one of you.
Sure. I am struck by thinking about the idea of multiple citizenships and what for many people is an assumption for Native peoples that once you then become a citizen in the United States, that your citizenship in your tribal nation is no more, and that people are perfectly capable of holding and understanding their identity as citizens in more than one way. So you can be a Chickasaw citizen and a United States citizen, for example, and that doesn't have to be a matter of crisis. It's a matter of fact. And that when in thinking about that, then people become very nimble and flexible in their relationships with the United States, with the state governments, and with their own tribe. There are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States, 38 federally recognized in Oklahoma. And I would suggest that Native women, for example, are especially interested in thinking about government as it presents itself locally and in small, in tribal governments, within clan systems, for example, or in particular ways that women can have and do have a unique and frankly very powerful voice. So I would like to think about multiple citizenships, and I would also, for those of you who are especially interested in how Native women participated nationally, not just in Indian Territory, but in many things. I just want to give a shout out to Kathleen Cahill, whose new book is coming out this November, Recasting the Vote, Women of Color and the Suffrage Movement. And anyway, I can't wait to get my hands on that, but she specifically shares the stories of a few women in particular.
And I'll follow on that. I think that the history of Reconstruction is usually narrated sort of around freedom, the fight for freedom, and the fight for citizenship. And those two things are usually married. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. We have the Reconstruction amendments, the 14th Amendment that grants citizenship and really changes citizenship. It becomes something that the federal government is pledging, at least in theory, to protect the privileges and rights of citizens. In my work, I've spent a lot of time thinking about aliens, so non-citizens instead, because I think that this focus in Reconstruction, where we're almost entirely talking about what is citizenship, what does it entail, who is excluded from citizenship, why they want citizenship. I think that that framing suggests that non-citizen is sort of somehow the opposite of citizen. But as our panelists have shown, there's many ways to be sort of a non-citizen or to be excluded from elements of citizenship. And alienage is a very specific kind of exclusion. And so in my work, I've been trying to think through how the government is not just creating citizens at this time and redefining what that's going to mean. It's also working through what alienage is going to mean. And Chinese women play a role in this, in part through legal challenges. One of the court cases I referenced, Chai Lung v. Friedman, goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And it is, it's sort of known as the case of 22 lewd Chinese women, because that is the alleged charge, and that is supposed to exclude them from the United States, the fact that they are lewd. But the Chinese women are protesting and testing what are their rights under the US Constitution as aliens. And they find that, for example, at the state level, they cannot be excluded in the way that they have been.
Wonderful. I think in your answers too, you have given us new ways of thinking about conceptualizing the period of Reconstruction, whether we conceptualize it in terms of multiple and overlapping sovereignties or of, emancipatory possibilities, but also laying down limits and defining citizenship in exclusionary ways. And I'm thinking particularly, Beth, of your book, The Chinese Must Go, also in this context. And I want to now sort of turn to asking you specific questions on your presentation before we open it up. I'm sure people are sort of really chomping at the bits to get their chance to ask you questions too. So I'll keep this short, and I'll begin again with the order that you spoke. I'll begin with Brittany, and Brittany, I have to say I really appreciated the way in which you are putting African American women back into the suffrage movement, right? And talking about their alternative conceptions of citizenship and democracy. We've often been told, the suffrage movement was racist, so we should look. And there's very important work, of course, being done on Black women's activism in the church. I'm thinking of Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, in the club movement, Deborah Gray White's work. And of course, many of these club women were also ardent suffragists, as were many of these women contending in the Baptist church. But I really like the way in which you talk about Black women's vision of citizenship and democracy, that the vote, in fact, did matter. Yes, there were other concerns, but that we must not lose sight of the value of looking at Black women's struggles precisely at this moment. And I love the Rollin sisters because they have a Black suffrage association, women's in South Carolina, long before Southern white women. And so it reminds me of some of those pioneering Black women who formed all Black women's abolitionist societies long before white women did. So I want you to talk a bit more about that, because I think it's really a valuable part of the history of suffrage during Reconstruction.
Yeah, thank you for that. So yes, Black women cared about the vote. And one of my favorite stories is not my research, but it's in this book called African American Women in the Vote. Came out many years ago, but there's a great story in that book about how in this period where Black men could vote, but Black women couldn't vote, they were like, look, the vote is ours as a community. And so there were these rogue Black men who would be trying to vote for Democrats when, this was the era of the Lincoln Republican. And so they called sex strikes. They refused to sleep with these men if they decided that they were going to vote Democratic. And so they were like, if only one of us gets to vote, then you vote for our entire household and all of our interests. And so it also speaks to a kind of pragmatism, even in these moments of exclusion, where Black women figure out a mode of citizenship in which they will be heard and which they will leverage whatever political power they have, even if it means leveraging a kind of intimate power to say that they have some say in the body politic. But also, it is a period to think about Black women's organizing. And so Martha Jones's work has been really helpful to me, both Vanguard, but also her earlier work, All Bound Up Together. And also, she is, the person, one of the key people to think about these things. And so part of what she argues, which I think is really important, is that Black women use the church as their own kind of public sphere to advocate for their right to have a voice in the very moment where they're being excluded from US citizenship concerns. But I also think that it does become important to say that there are these Black women who are making arguments about what the vote can and should do for Black people and why it has to matter. And then they follow that up with real kind of organizing and making demands. So the Rollin sisters are thinking and talking about the vote throughout the late 1860s, and then they follow it up by starting their own branch of the American Woman Suffrage Association, creating their own suffrage societies in South Carolina. So part of what I think, the thing where we're, the very contemporary investment that we have in the idea that Black women are consistent in terms of the way that they vote and participate, I think that what this old history teaches us is the really long history of how Black women have come to value the vote. Because when you've been excluded and you've had to organize and fight for it, and you've had to figure out a community argument for why it has value, then that shapes the sort of generational narrative that is passed down about why the vote continues to matter. And so all of these women are super fun to think and talk about. And I really love the Rollin sisters too.
Yeah, and just as you were talking, I was also thinking of Elsa Barkley Brown's, pathbreaking work in looking at how Black women, even when they are deprived of the vote, participate in reconstructing American democracy. And so I found your answer really spoke to that very well.
And we also cannot forget Rosalind Turberg Penn.
Absolutely
foundational and pivotal to this country.
Absolutely. I think her work in just excavating, numerous instances, we all build on her work. And I think it is so important, in fact, to recover Black women's role in the suffrage movement. Otherwise, we silence them the way many white suffragists did. So yes, I completely agree with that. Moving on to Amanda, again, such a rich presentation, Amanda, and the ways in which you looked at, these different Indian nations and then honed down on the Chickasaw women, and you ended up with that wonderful document of the Oklahoma Suffrage Association. Reminded me again of the Suffrage Association founded by the Rollin sisters. When we think about Reconstruction in African American history, we are very careful when we talk about the South, to talk about these different locations, the border slave states that were still part of the Union, where Reconstruction proceeded differently, to the former Confederate states, and within that, states that had Black majorities or near Black majorities like, South Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana. And I was just wondering, within what you had presented, if you would talk about, and I love the maps that you put up for us, because it really gave us a sense of all those different native sovereignties in Indian territory. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about how the situation may have been similar or differed between these polities. A lot of people are being shoved into this area by the US government. You have the origin of the 5 Southern nations, and then you have many of these others. And I was wondering if you would comment on that a little bit, especially in terms of women's roles. Were they all matrilineal? Was there a tradition of maybe of wielding a certain amount of political authority and social and cultural authority, or were things different amongst these nations?
Things were I'm glad you asked this. Things were very different among these different nations. They come from, many diverse, distinctive forms of government, distinctive cultures from different parts and geographies. And really that 1871 break is really important here. In the aftermath of the Civil War, and Indian Territory became an important theater of the US Civil War at this time. But so the first tribes to be removed were forcibly removed during a period where treaty making was still the policy of the day. So the treaties were more formal, more diplomatic, negotiated for longer periods of time. The 5 tribes received lands in fee simple. So it set up this very independent autonomous system. As the policy shifted past 1871 and the treaty making era ended, then we introduced the idea of the reservation, of military conquest and removal to Indian Territory as a consequence, as a punishment for such. So the agreements, no longer treaties, become less formal, less diplomatic, less not negotiated, and with less and less choice on the part of the tribes involved, and distinctly gendered. As the United States government, its own patriarchal systems, assumed such systems in all other sovereigns, right, in indigenous sovereigns, and so would specifically deal with the men of a tribe, right? And not all tribes were matriarchal or even matrilineal, but women have played significant roles in every tribe and in the relationships and power structures. And so relegating the women to the side and to the background was really a dramatic and radical shift in how to work within that system. And in those intergovernmental relationships. And so the idea, for example, in that handbill, and I love that, and that one of the things that they talked about is bearing children, right? And so bearing children is an idea of that as giving you more experience and more wisdom, right? Not less or a job to the side. So that one of the things mentioned in that particular document is, well, you say that we're supposed to be at home with the kids, but the kids grow up and then we still can't vote. That's actually a piece of what is in that document, which I find fascinating. So we make sure you have time for Beth here.
Yes, absolutely. I could hear you all the time. It's wonderful. I loved your answer too, because it doesn't posit sort of simple binaries between sovereignty and citizenship. You show what a complicated and intersecting story that is for Native American nations, right? Because often when it is told in simple ways in the history of Reconstruction, it's like it's citizenship for Black people, it's sovereignty for Native American people. Well, no, there's a long history of treaty making, the end of the era of different nations and different.
Not all of the different nations got along with each other in their inter-sovereign relationships. Some tribes were expressly placed in the same on the same reservation in order to confederate them because they didn't get along, to hasten some sort of tribal dissolution. But generally, policymakers' lack of understanding of people's ability to adapt and continue, it's sorely underestimated.
Right, absolutely. And that's what I loved about the ending document, because it's a suffrage association, but the language is native and the claims are native. So again, showing that wonderful interplay. Going on to Beth here, and please, after Beth, you speak, if you would like to ask each other some questions, feel free to do so. I know I'm the moderator, but you do have the opportunity to talk to each other too. So Beth, what is so fascinating about your research amongst these court cases in terms of the kinds of claims that Chinese American women are making on the state, on the judicial system, is that even though there are these exclusionary laws and categories that kind of vilify them, right, virtually in terms of sexuality, they are still actually making freedom claims based on, sort of very, the kinds of understandings of citizenship that African Americans are also using, throughout the period, certainly before the Civil War, whether it's, habeas corpus or certain recognition of everyday claims, even a claim to legality of your own marriage and family and so to me, that was, I always thought, again, this is a more complicated story than that, it's just all exclusion for Chinese Americans, and especially for Chinese American women who've been stigmatized in this way by the law. But instead, you are again telling us a far more complex story, which I found really interesting. So if you would elaborate on that, especially on looking at sexuality in the ways in which that is being used by the state, in the ways in which certainly these women who are fighting the cases are reimagining themselves in very different ways.
Yeah, I think there's been an assumption for a long time that that Chinese immigrants were excluded from courtroom testimony, and certainly there was a ruling in 1854 that excluded them from courtroom testimony in California. There were laws that attempted to keep them out of courts. But what I'm finding by actually going back to court transcripts is that the Chinese immigrants, both men and women, still go to the US court system. And this is a new project. I'm still trying to figure this out. How they do so, how their voice is heard in various ways, why they found the court system to be so powerful for them. But my hypothesis is I actually think I see a disproportionate number of court cases brought by either brought by Chinese women or arising from complaints made by Chinese women as opposed to men. And one of my hypotheses of this is that although there were within the Chinese American diaspora sort of modes of negotiating and reconciling disputes sort of within Chinatown, within the community, I think that those sorts of ways of negotiating did not always turn out well for women. So my guess is that they are disproportionately going to the US justice system because it is sort of another form of governance, another source of power that's sort of purposefully outside of the Chinese American community.
Fascinating. Yeah, it reminds me of all the freedom suits that African American women led to before the Civil War. But it is, an amazing, I know you're at the beginning of this project, but it is amazing to think about the ways in which certainly immigrant groups, even when they are being stigmatized, are laying claim to the state in certain ways. We are running out of time quite a bit here, and I know I need to go on to the Q&A from the audience, and we have many questions here, and I apologize to those members of the audience if I can't reach, come to your questions. Some are, I think I could answer quite simply by saying that, there were some questions about the books that Amanda and Brittany mentioned, Kathleen Cahill's book, which is forthcoming, which is going to be a brilliant book, and also sort of change the way in which we view the suffrage movement. And Brittany's shout out to this very foundational, formative work by Rosalind Turbuck Penn on African American women and the struggle for the vote. So those were the two questions, and I just answered them because I thought I wouldn't waste your time and you could do the more substantial answers. The first question, actually, Beth, stay with us, is for you. The first question is a quick question, was what are the results of some of these lawsuits?
That is often harder to determine than you would think. It's amazing you can find a folder with all of these transcripts and not always find the result. Like I said, the immigration one, which is the Chai Lung v. Friedman, went all the way up to the Supreme Court. It actually spawned multiple lawsuits and has a very complex history. But ultimately, the women won their suit, saying that that California, that the states did not have within their police powers the ability to exclude in this way. That's one of those stories where it starts out sounding like a wonderful success story and ends up very dark, because Congress, even just in anticipation of this ruling, then turned towards federal immigration control. And so the first with the Page Act targeting Chinese women, and then later we'll see this with Chinese restriction, Chinese exclusion, and a bunch of other federal laws that actually were more sort of invasive and pervasive than state laws ever could be. Some of the other women, I think in the other two cases, neither of them were won. So the Central Pacific Railroad successfully contested Seacan's marriage, saying that a Chinese marriage made under sort of Chinese tradition should not be recognized in a US court, or at least that they also needed some sort of American legal records to show a marriage. I don't want to take up too much time, but the other two, they lost these lawsuits.
Yeah, so I would like the other two speakers here to also weigh in. There's another question which is sort of connected to the question asked of you, Beth, and this is a question from Professor Durga Mitra, which I think is a very valuable kind of question about how law is being constituted at this point. And I'd like to talk to Brittany and Amanda about this too, because, as Brittany pointed out in her presentation, this is the moment, that in a way, the American democracy is being reconstructed. And certainly Black people and African American women have their own notions of what that should take, how that should take place. So if you could talk about that, and Amanda, you too, in terms of just treaty making powers, Indian sovereignties, and then the question of US law. I know, and I've read a little bit on the ways in which the 13th and the 14th Amendments are actually implemented in Indian territory, and the problems sometimes that causes too. So if you could talk a little bit about not just state formation, but also the ways in which structures of law are being put into place at this time by the federal government, by the US government, and the ways in which people are choosing to leverage it or change it or interrogate it. So why don't we begin with Brittany and then Amanda? Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I think that what we can say is that Black folks are always making the claim that rights are contingent in the U.S. context, and they're always trying to figure out how to shift the terrain of that. And so for white people, they really understand rights to be things that are legally codified and don't typically move. And that's why you see so much white grief as we're watching like the sort of Trump show, right? But for Black people, this offering of rights and then taking them away is what our history is like. And so there is the sense that political conditions shape what legal possibilities are available to us. And so this is why you then see African-American women making these arguments about what are other contexts in which we can argue for rights. And so it's notable to me that Charlotte Rollin essentially argues, she's arguing in the same moment that she argues for voting as a human right. Let's not forget the context, which is that she's also having to argue for Black humanity on its face, right? That's not a given either. And in fact, that this idea that Black people could be, that they are free and that they are sort of full-fledged human beings that get to participate in the body politic is a really new idea if we think about this as happening 5 years after the end of the Civil War. And so there are a couple of levels on which a claim like that operates, which is to say, A, we're human, and therefore we get to make a claim about our right to participate. And so I think that that will truck with the way that you see African-American women engaging the law going forward. It's also important that in that same year, Marianne Shad Carey says, look, I've got to, get this law degree, right? I've got to go to Howard. I've got to complete a law degree. She's I think she's only like the second Black woman that had a law degree at that time. I think Charlotte Ray precedes her, but she's the second Black woman to have a law degree in the country. And then she uses that to fight for her right to vote, right? And so that tells you kind of how the variety of fronts on which Black women are fighting. And she's only allowed to vote in the District of Columbia. And she's able to make that claim because she makes a federal argument, and the federal government has control over DC in a way that doesn't have control over all these other kind of state, all these other state-based contexts. And so that means that Black women are being pragmatic, they're being politically savvy, and that they're also making the argument in a variety of places. So they're making the claim about human rights, which is a principal argument. It's a moral suasion argument, right? And then they're also beginning to kind of build the legal case for thinking about what the tone and tenor of Black rights will be in the decades going forward.
Well, this is your question was very interesting and complex, and I'm trying to figure out just how to tackle it. But something that I really want to get across here, 1870 to the turn of the century and then on for a long period was a very dark period for the sovereign nations, for sovereign Indian nations at this time. At the time of the turn of the century, Native population was actually fewer than 300,000 people. That is the result of the genocidal policies that had been in place up to that time. At the turn of the century, then strict assimilationist policies were codified. So the legal structure, the implementation of the United States criminal jurisdiction, the implementation of all of US laws. So really, Native peoples were almost buried under an avalanche of law at this point. Native religions were outlawed. Native boarding schools where children were kidnapped and taken far away into federally run off-reservation boarding schools was in place. Native languages were prohibited from being spoken. The list goes on and on and on. Forced sterilization of Native American women in Indian health services. And so this dark period lasts for a long time. It was not, in fact, until after World War I in 1924 that Native people, the Indian Citizenship Act was passed. And that, in fact, so if you weren't made a citizen at the time of allotment in the Dawes Allotment Act, then here was 1924. But then it was into the 1960s before every Native American person in the country was enfranchised to vote. So law, I'm trying to think who said it. I believe it was Jace Weaver who said, aside from a Native person's family, clan, and tribe, your most significant relationship is with the federal government. So I appreciate what Brittany had to say about, and so the new battlefield is the court, and so become lawyers and learn to represent, don't just hire lawyers, become lawyers, learn to represent yourself, learn the ins and outs of government and the multiple different ways to participate in it, both through voting, which is critical, through running for office with this, which is critical, but through all of the different types of relationship and forms of political engagement that can lead to power. And of course, right now, we're in a moment, look at, Deb Haaland, US Congressman, we're all so proud. So there are great strides being made. And there's also part of a theoretical movement of rematriation, that we are discussing constantly, that I think is relevant to this moment, and returning to matriarchal practices, and doing that in the local, the cultural, but looking at these practices and legal mechanisms through, say, graves and repatriation and rematriation. So I'm getting a little far afield here, but I wanted to give you a sample of the enormous breadth in which work is ongoing. So thank you.
Thank you, Amanda, for that. And thank you for connecting it to the present day. I'm not an essentialist. I'm not a gender essentialist, but, people like Deb Haaland and women leaders all over the world have just done such a better job of managing the pandemic. For instance, people have been noticing that. But, this leads me to a couple of questions, which I'm going to combine just for the sake of time. One of our questioners, who actually has worked quite a bit herself on, international suffrage movements, is asking all your panelists, and you let me just indicate which one of you would like to answer this question, about how we should perhaps reconceptualize the suffrage movement in transnational ways. This speaks to a little bit about how Amanda brought in the notions of different polities and sovereignties, but thinking more broadly also of women who are seen as alien in this country, but clearly are coming from a place with its own history of state making, of belonging, national belonging. Would any of you like to speak to this question? There was another questioner who asked about South Asian women, and I'll just quickly answer that. I actually did come across a South Asian woman who came to the United States, Pandita Ramabai, and who spoke a lot under the auspices of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was the largest women's organization, not the suffrage movements. And interestingly enough, Brittany, as you know, this is the organization where Frances Ellen Watkins Harper also found a political home. And when they adopt suffrage as one of their platforms, they actually do reach out to women all over the world. They have these organizations all over the world, and it's interesting how they negotiate discourses of Western imperialism and racism with ideas about women's rights. So I'll just answer that very quickly, but I want you all to think about this a little bit. I know that you were speaking very specifically about groups of people within the North American continent, whether they belong to the United States or whether they have their own sovereignties. What do you think about this, about thinking about a kind of a more of a transnational turn towards understanding the suffrage movement?
If I may, I would just say that I think that the transnational movement leads us to a conversation of colonialism, settler colonialism, and decolonization and decolonizing those systems, and that regardless of individual experience, becomes a common thread for many people, in particular, both decolonization, but recovery and healing as part of that as well. And that's healing political systems and having voice within that as well. And I'll stop there.
Anyone else want to tackle this question? Otherwise, I know we are running out of time. So I will throw a softball to all three of you from one of the members of our audience. I thought that was an interesting question. And that is for each of you to think about and to name a personal heroine from this period. We normally don't think about heroes and heroines when we study history and we study the complexity of the situation that people find themselves in and the difficult choices sometimes that they're confronted with. But I think this might be coming from a student, and it might be a nice way to address his or her question?
I have many heroines. And when I do history, I actually, I fall in love with these women, because I just know that they're facing conditions that are so far afield of what I know and understand. So my two usual suspects are Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells, who were both club women and suffragists and also nemesis to each other quite often. Their relationship was very interesting. They had really different tactical approaches to fighting for Black people's rights, but they both loved Black folks and felt like, and also had an investment in the idea that America could be better. And I think that that's an enduring idea when you think about Black women's political thought, not all Black women across all time, but certainly in this period, there is this clear sense that Black women are going to hold the nation to account for what it says it can be, and they're going to put their bodies and their bodies on the line to try to make that be so. And those are two of my favorite women who take no prisoners in their own way.
I love that. Yes. I mean, in a time when, we are living under a time when we feel American democracy is under siege, all those people who fought for these, they're certainly, and unsung heroines, right? Sometimes unsung heroines of the project of American democracy. Which one of you would like to go next? I'm going to let you unmute yourselves.
I can jump in. Yeah. I don't usually think about it this way, about heroines. And in my work, I look so much at, the lower classes. These are not people that are writing intellectual texts where we can sort of have access to all of their hopes and desires. But I'll talk about one woman. Her name was, according to court documents, Yun Ji, and she lived in Chinatown in Los Angeles in the 1870s and 80s. And I think she's a hero in part because she ran away. And I've been really paying a lot of attention to Chinese women running away from systems of oppression, whether it's sex trafficking, which a lot of Chinese women encountered, or it's persecution by the American state. And so she ran away from a brothel in Los Angeles and got all the way to San Francisco before she was captured and brought back to Los Angeles, where she then was brought into court. And I feel like when we're looking for heroes, it's important, I think, to look for not just the people that are sort of allowed to speak or where their words are recorded for us, but also the people that did heroic things just through actions. And so I think that the stories of women running away from things they found unacceptable is another sort of heroic act.
Oh, I completely agree. I think subaltern people play such an important role in defining freedom claims, human rights, as Brittany put it, and we normally don't think of that. So, having studied a lot of fugitive slaves over the years and thinking of fugitivity as a political act, I totally get what you're saying, Beth. Go ahead, Amanda. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
Oh, I was just going to say, I'm not going to name a specific person. Instead, I'm going to name all of the women who attended Native American boarding schools, who, whether they were the Chickasaw-run boarding schools that were in existence prior to the federal boarding school policy, or the later off-reservation federal boarding school policies, those schools in particular, these later ones, were designed to strip people of cultural and political power in any way, and instead those women used them as a platform and a site for unification, for political and cultural resurgence. And that blows me away.
Thank you so much for all your insights and your wonderful presentation. That concludes the program. I want to say thank you to our panelists again for your thoughtful presentations and perspectives. And I also want to thank the audience for terrific questions. And I apologize that I couldn't get to all your questions. I mean, there were just so many, and we would have had our speakers here for a very long time if I asked each and every one of them. I would also like to thank the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, whose support has made this conference possible, and Radcliffe's multi-year exploration of gender and voting rights, something that I have benefited from too in my own work. I hope you'll be able to join us and participate in future Radcliffe virtual programs, including the continuation of this virtual conference, Voting Matters, Gender, Citizenship, and the Long 19th Amendment. A full list of the remaining conference sessions will appear on your screen momentarily, and you can also find that on Radcliffe's website, radcliffe.harvard.edu. Finally, I hope you will visit the Long 19th Amendment online portal, which can also be accessed through the Radcliffe website. The portal is an open access digital platform that includes fascinating digital exhibition titled Seeing Citizens, Picturing American Women's Fight for the Vote. Thank you again for joining us. Take care, and we hope to see you at the next session of this conference.